Well, this is All Out Politics news, debate and opinion from the heart of Westminster. Both candidates in the Conservative leadership race have used the term Marxist to attack and, as they see it, insult Jeremy Corbyn. But the Conservative MP Robert Halfon has questioned whether the term Marxist actually means anything to anyone these days, especially younger people. Well, to those attending this weekend's Marxism Festival in London, presumably it does have some significance. So what is the state of Marxism in the UK in 2019? Joining me to discuss that are Sally Campbell. She's the editor of the Socialist Review and will be speaking at that festival, and Dr. Christoph Schuringer, who is a philosopher at the New College of the Humanities. Welcome to you both. This sort of festival, is this a kind of sort of hobbyist club like, you know, the Sealed Knot Society, or does it actually have any political relevance today, do you think?
I think it absolutely does. I mean, I think what we see at Marxism Festival is a lot of political activists, people who are in trade unions or in, you know, there's members of the Labour Party, there's people who are socialists, and lots of students as well, who do want to try and understand, I think, not just politics in Britain today, but have a global picture. And
if you say, I don't know whether you do say that about yourself, but if you say, I am a Marxist today, what does that mean? What does that mean you believe?
Well, for me, I would say I'm a Marxist, and I think that means that, you know, when I look at what Marx wrote, you know, a couple of centuries ago, he was writing about a system emerging which was centred around a minority who own and control the wealth, and the vast majority who have to sell their ability to work for a wage. And I think that's still fundamentally the world we live in today. He also talked about the way that capitalism, the system he was describing, was globalising, the way it was spreading out around the planet. And I think we've seen that fully play out over the past century.
So what is it? I mean, is it Marxism, common ownership of goods and property?
No, for me, Marxism, and I think for Marx, Marxism was about, it was about ultimately getting rid of the state, getting rid of classes, getting rid of a minority owning and controlling things, and it being about self-emancipation and about collective organisation, really, from the ground up.
Well, as Sally Campbell says, it was 200 years ago that this philosophy sort of started unfolding. Does it still have a relevance today, do you think?
I think one of the extraordinary things about Marx actually is if you read his writings, and his writings consist of extremely detailed analyses of how capitalism works, the dynamics of capitalism, how it is that capital flows through the system and so on. If you read these analyses, it's extraordinary that they actually have much more relevance today than they did in Marx's time. I mean, Marx didn't foresee globalization, which is effectively the globalization of capital. Everything that we do is connected with the flow of capital around the world. The iPhone in my pocket is made by somebody in South China, and capitalism controls my life to the point that, you know, I need to own such devices in order even to stay in touch with my friends and so on. So there's a sense in which capitalism has shown itself to be globalizable and to be, in fact, far more resilient.
Is it the analysis rather than the solutions offered that's significant about Marx today, then?
I think the analysis is tremendously important. We often talk about Marxism as if Marx was providing some sort of blueprint for a society, and as if, you know, there were certain societies, like we think of the Soviet Union, for example, that try to implement what we think of as Marxist programs. But I think that Marx is actually very clear about is that he's against the idea, given how complex society is, he's against the idea of laying down a blueprint for what a so-called communist society looks like. As Sally was saying, Marx actually believed in the withering away of the state. He doesn't believe at all in a centralized state that's going to turn people into kind of mass of uniformed workers, or, you know, going to the factory and so on. That's not at all Marx's vision, and he says this to fellow socialists when he speaks at a discussion of what's called the Gotha program. He says, you know, what's wrong with many people who are trying to get communism is that they think that they can lay down in advance what a society looks like. It's actually far too complex to do that.
On that basis, do you identify Jeremy Corbyn or John McDonnell or any of those around him as Marxists? Because they are all people who have a model for society with increased public ownership.
Well, I think there's certainly people in the Labour Party who would identify themselves as Marxists. I don't think Jeremy Corbyn particularly is a Marxist. I think he's a principled socialist who believes...
Why isn't he a Marxist?
Well, I can't speak for Jeremy Corbyn, just to be clear, but I think, you know, Corbyn and most people in the Labour Party really feel that the focus for political change and social change is Parliament. It's about getting a government elected. I think for Marx, that can be part of the struggle, but it's not ultimately the thing, is it? When he talked about the state, when Marx talked about the state, you know, he's talking about the much bigger bodies which really operate independently of democratic control. And I think that's still the issue for me today. So, I mean, I'm not a member of the Labour Party, and largely because I think that who's in number 10 Downing Street is important, and I'd love to see Jeremy, you know, as Prime Minister, but it's not the be-all and end-all. There are much bigger questions.
The charge against Marxism, or if you like, the charge against communism, is what happened in Soviet Russia, what happened in China, maybe what's even happening in Venezuela today. And, you know, the question is, why would a British politician want in any way to identify with those societies, given, you know, the terrible loss of life and repression which all those societies saw?
Right, this is something I was trying to allude to earlier. A thing that's immediately said about Marxism is that, well, we have instances of Marxism, for example, in the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union didn't, the conditions weren't actually right in the Soviet Union to do any of the things that Marx was arguing for. And Marx is very specific that communism, communism can in fact only...
You don't think that Marx's philosophy, or the attempt to apply it, led to, you know, the Gulag, effectively?
Well, the attempt, we can call it the attempt to apply it, but what's clear is that, so Marx says that communism can only happen in advanced industrial societies. Russia was not an advanced industrial society, it was a peasant society. And what in fact happened in Russia was a small number of people seized control. They then tried to...
And China as well.
Right, and then they tried to force through an industrial revolution in conditions completely different from capitalism, in fact, and institute a system that bears almost no relation to what Marx was in fact arguing for. So the thing that we have to keep on doing, and this is why things like the Marxism Festival are important, is we have to demystify this connection that exists. And it's clear why the connection exists between Marxism and those sorts of forms of government that actually have very little to do with it. It's because it's in the interests of certain power interests to make it seem as if Marxism is a nefarious and dangerous thing.
But, I mean, take Venezuela, for example. That was a rich society that did have resources, it did have an educated population, and yet the application, you know, by Chavez of his version of Marxism, you know, has resulted in poverty, people fleeing the country, people not getting medical treatment.
I mean, again, I mean, I would agree with Christoph that I don't think, you know, we can simply talk about application of Marxism, but I agree, you know, Chavez was certainly called himself a Marxist. I think that the problem with trying to build like an island of socialist utopia in a capitalist globalised world is that you can't really do that. And I think Venezuela's fortunes have been very much tied to the price of oil in a global scale. And I don't think that, you know, one nation state can overcome that. I think for me, the problem with Venezuela is it didn't go far enough. It didn't challenge the power of capital in a real way. I think Chavez is, you know, the good days, the days of the reforms and people feeling better about their livelihoods, came off the back of the wealth that he got from the oil. It didn't come from actually really appropriating the wealth off of the capitalists.
What about Chavez? Was he a Marxist?
Well, as Ali says, you know, there are obviously affinities between the kind of socialist program that Chavez was going for in Marxism, but we have to understand the concrete political situation here, right? And this is something that Marx himself is always emphasizing. We have to understand the material conditions under which real people in the real world are operating. And if we look at South American countries that have, to various degrees of success, have implemented socialist programs, a thing that we have to realize is that America, that is the United States of America, in fact, has a kind of stranglehold on these nations in terms of the extraordinary disproportionate power that the United States has in terms of the interests of capitalism as they're played out in South America.
If Karl Marx was with us today, would he vote for Jeremy Corbyn?
very difficult to say. Marx was someone who was extremely sensitive to historical circumstances. One of the things that's absolutely groundbreaking about his work is that he thinks very, very carefully about the historical circumstances which have led to the particular kind of situations that people find themselves in. So it would be wrong to just generalize from what Marx was able to say in the 19th century to a situation in which capitalism has advanced to a point that Marx couldn't even have imagined himself.
What do you reckon?
I think in a choice between Corbyn and Boris, he would vote for Corbyn, but I don't think he would say it would stop there. Corbyn's only as strong as the movement on the ground around him.
Thank you both very much indeed, and enjoy the festival.